Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim Snow. I will be the moderator for this session. Just a couple of quick reminders before we get to our presenters. One, for the presenters, we ask them to respect the 15-minute time limit. And for the rest of you, we ask that you put questions and comments in the Q&A box, and that link is at the bottom of your screen. So I encourage you to not only ask questions, but to offer comments as well. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Stacey Mitchell and Crystal Garrett. It's all you.
So I'm Dr. Stacey Mitchell, and Dr. Crystal Garrett and I, we are put together a presentation about high impact practices in the classroom. And the example that we're going to be using is moot courts. So I've done some moot courts in the past with my classes. And so first, Dr. Garrett's going to introduce high impact practices and talk about some of what that entails. And then I'm going to briefly talk about some other examples of things that I've used in the past, which we can talk about more in the Q&A. And then I'll talk specifically about moot courts. So Dr. Garrett, take it away. Oh, wait, let me make sure this thing is, okay, there we go. Okay.
Thank you. So high impact practices. These are some of the ideas that have come about using this word cloud. Thank you. Stacey.
Oh, okay, got it.
Okay, what are high impact practices? Well, these are opportunities that students and faculty engage in together, and they're very helpful according to the Association of American Colleges and Universities. They often show that students learn more, they retain more, and it improves student success. I'd like to read a quote from the Association for Experiential Learning. Educators purposefully engage with learners in direct experience and focus reflection in order to increase knowledge, develop skills, clarify values, develop people's capacity to contribute to their communities. That's very important, that students have a hands-on approach and reflect as they reflect on what they've learned using their critical thinking skills. So there is a process. Usually it's the activity, reflection. The reflection is, what does that experience mean to me? Okay, conceptualization. Why did this experience happen? Application, they would be applying what they learned into the classroom or what they learned in the classroom and so forth.
Is it not changing? Oh, hold on a second. I'm sorry. There we go. Sorry about that.
So the benefits of HIPS, these are real world experiences that students have the opportunity to learn. So they tend to really provide interaction between faculty and students. And they also increase diversity in the classroom. Different perceptions and ideas come across with these high impact practices. They understand why they are doing what they're doing. It's not just in the classroom when they say, oh, I don't even know why I took that class. Well, they will learn why they took the class and all of the components, the concepts as well. It's also, these are skills that they can transfer with them to other classes and also to even their work. They use their critical thinking skills, and it empowers them because of the knowledge. That it also HIPS tend to increase retention and representation in the classroom. And Stacey is going to tell you about her experience using high impact practices.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So the example that I'm going to be talking about today is the use of moot courts, but there's some other things that I've done. Just briefly, we can talk about in the Q&A. I did a study abroad last year to Europe where we focused on the Holocaust. We went to the Anne Frank House and some other things, and students wrote experiential essays about those things. In some of my classes, we've listened to victims' testimonials from the Shoah Project. I've done virtual field trips, which has really worked out well, and I've done field trips as well. So those are just some of the high impact practice things we can talk about in the Q&A. But for now, it works. Okay, moot courts. The benefits associated with moot courts, I feel, for genocide education is that it gets everybody involved in the project, right? So everyone's involved, and they're going to have, through conducting these moot courts, a greater understanding of international law. It's more of the what's genocide under international law, what are crimes against humanity under international law. We also worked on war crimes, right? What's the difference between the contexts of all of these different events? Who are the perpetrators? What are the obstacles to prosecution of these different crimes? So it really gets them thinking in a critical way, right, about what international law is, what is involved in genocide prosecution. And another important thing that's beneficial here, I say teamwork and all of that, right? But it improves their writing skills, right? And it really gets them involved in critical thinking because they have to form an argument. Okay, so there we go. What I did, this was a couple years ago. This was 2022, probably when I did this, for a global issues class that I was teaching. The global issues class at Georgia State Perimeter College is like an intro to IR, intro to international relations class. And I was trying to think up something that was a way, because I always cover human rights law, and then international criminal law. And I was trying to think of a way to really get students interested in this instead of just sitting there listening to me drone on and on about this stuff. So I decided that why don't we do a simulation of the International Criminal Court. And we're going to try some of the leaders of the military junta in Myanmar for the Rohingya killings. I think we also put Aung San Suu Kyi on trial too, back when she was in the government. And so I divided the class up into 3 different groups. One was a prosecution team. One was a defense team, right? So we had the defense. We had a group of judges, right? And I picked these guys sort of randomly, just, and once they started, they're divided into 3 groups. What we were going to do was, the project was to, let's just assume that the military leaders and Aung San Suu Kyi were convicted, right? And they're appealing their conviction in the ICC. So it was going to be the appeals process. And so the prosecution, actually the defense team, they make their appeals brief, and they required to address the context of the case, all of the different crimes with which their folks were convicted. Were there any issues of law that were violated in the prosecution of their folks? What does it mean to be convicted of genocide? What does it mean to be convicted of crimes against humanity? Did the prosecution err in any way? And so they constructed a brief. The prosecution constructed their response brief. And then what we did was, this was like the second half of the semester was when we worked on this. So we had about like 6 weeks or so. So we took our time, and we had, we met in class, we discussed, progress, things that students needed to work on, those kinds of things. And we eventually had the oral arguments, right? So the defense team would make their argument, the prosecution team made theirs. And then we had the team of judges who were that already looked at both briefs, right? And so they met, out of class, met and discussed how they're going to decide. And so after we had the 2 oral arguments, we had them issue their decision. And it was really, the students got really interested in, what does genocide mean? What do you have to demonstrate to be able to successfully prosecute people for genocide, the differences between all of the crimes, and how difficult it really is, right? I think they gained an appreciation of how difficult it is to really, put the bad guys in jail, right? But this was coming out of a whole, like a big chunk of the semester. They already, had a familiarity, a working familiarity with the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, the Rome Statute, right? And so they wrote their briefs from there. And I also I co-authored a textbook on moot courts about 10 years ago. And so they were able to use that. That was available in the library for free, right? So they were able to use that kind of as a guide and how to construct briefs, the types of arguments to make, how to cite cases, those types of things. So, my time is up. Okay. Overall, I think it was a really, really good way of, getting them involved, giving them greater writing skills, research skills, critical thinking, those types of things. I haven't done it again. I'm putting together a new genocide class. And I'm probably going to return to this for that specifically. So this I used in an IR class, but I teach a specific genocide class. I'm going to be using another simulation. Maybe we'll put Putin on trial. I don't know. There's some people coming up here. So and we'll sort of organize things around that. But yeah, it's really effective. Students like it. They have a good time. It also helps their presentation skills. I forgot to mention that. So yeah. If I'll be happy to answer any questions about, what you have to do to make this work and other examples of HIPS practice.
Okay, let's move on to our second presenter. Stephanie, are you ready to go?
I am, thank you. My name is Stephanie Krzeminski. I am very glad to be with you all today, and I'm very glad for the opportunity to be speaking to all of you and to share with you the story of some local survivors from the Midwest. My presentation, as well as my doctoral thesis, was entitled "Don't Forget to Tell Them." And it's called that because I kept imagining this situation happening, where if I could just bring one of these folks back into my classroom, and I'd be thinking about all the things that I want to make sure they're going to tell them this and tell them this and tell them this. And inevitably, just as soon as they would get up to begin presenting, I'd grab their arm and go, wait, don't forget to tell them. And unfortunately now, the three people that you see in front of you, Ava Core and Fritzi Fritzl and Aaron Elster, are no longer here with us, but their stories and their avatars, by way of the iWitness testimony program and the Dimensions in Testimony programs. I'll show you how all of this kind of converges for a classroom setting. Having already said that, there's a lot going on here. So what I want to really focus on are a series of lesson plans that I developed that became the basis for my dissertation. And these lesson plans were going to be interdisciplinary. They were going to involve and rely heavily on Holocaust research, primary testimonies, looking at things like social emotional learning, a background of ACEs and PACEs. And I was heavily influenced by Bruce Perry's neurosequential model for education. And that also becomes a large aspect of these plans. And I'll show you more about that soon. The other thing that I wanted you to understand, the pedagogy in terms of how these lesson plans had been built, relies in seeing this experience as a form of memory practice. The breakdown of what I'm trying to do is probably best shared with you when I continue moving along. So let me show you this. Big picture, what I'm trying to focus on is what theoretically secondary teachers can be using as a unit plan. All of the lessons that I designed could be used as standalones, but I think they hold the greatest potential for impact by utilizing them as a unit plan. And that helps to build upon the conversations that these are rooted in. So these lesson plans are designed around creating an informed conversation between a secondary student and a Holocaust survivor avatar of either Fritzi Fritzshall, Aaron Elster, or Ava Kaur. And the focus of these conversations is really going to be on one deep memory that's examined through multiple testimonies given by this same survivor. What I'm then building into this are an introduction to the psychological concepts and the brain science behind what's going on, with the opportunity to apply this information from the student's perspective. And that might be a tall order, but I want you to understand what the goal is. And the goal here is a transference of resilience. The more that we can begin to give little pieces of hope, of courage, of examples of what this can look like, the receiver of this information is taking all of that in. And the goal here is to create enough of that education, enough of that foundation that students can call on that when they may need to. I also included some responses of students when I've done some of these lessons before, in terms of what were they getting out of this and what did it mean to have these kinds of experiences. I highlighted here the few that I think are worth noting. But I also want you to know that the lesson plans here were designed with student choice and student engagement in mind. Like Dr. Fry had said earlier about the idea of trauma-informed practices and the importance of resilience and empowerment. These resources that I've built are hopefully going to allow students to place the testimonial trauma in a space that makes sense to them right now, but ideally is going to be useful for them in the future. So the deep memories that I focused on with the three individuals here broke down, as you can see. And in each one of these lesson plans and stories really focuses in on this one special or specific moment where, as the survivor explains what had happened, there's almost this sense that they've gone somewhere else. And when you kind of notice, or you can observe that sense, or better yet, we can teach our students to recognize these signs. We can begin to get a more clear idea on which aspects of their story perhaps most deeply impacted them, and how can we better understand that and apply that learning. So I am going to give you an opportunity to kind of see some of this in action in just a little bit, but there are a few more things I'd like you to know about, because I think you've heard from so many additional speakers talking about the importance of things like localized history, the importance of social emotional learning, and the importance of using primary testimony. What I want to kind of begin showing you is that if we can introduce some basic psychological principles, some basic modes of information that our students can use and then apply, we're off to a really good start. On the left-hand side here, you see kind of an inverted pyramid, and think of this as the brain in terms of how it works. Earlier, Dr. Fry had mentioned that idea of the lizard brain. That's what's going on down here. Now, to give you an idea of what has to happen in order for us to be only operating from the brainstem, we can go to this area over here. This is at a point where you can no longer have any sense of time. This is where things that are happening by reflex. You are in a state of terror. She mentioned that idea of fight or flight, as well as fawn earlier. At the point where we go up into the cortical area, this is going to be really the sweet spot. This is where we can tell time. But I think when we consider the kinds of traumatic stories that we have heard from survivors, oftentimes there's something in that story that resonates with the idea of, it felt like I was there for a million years, or I'm sure it could have only lasted a couple of seconds, but time is somehow perceived differently. Introducing how the brain or where the brain is processing at that point, I think provides a lot of information to secondary students in terms of how they can better understand not just the story in front of them, but the stories that they're also trying to figure out for themselves. As teachers, you're probably very familiar with the idea of Abraham Maslow, and it's been said that we can't do Bloom until we've done Maslow. What's also very interesting about this neurosequential map and the idea of kind of looking at the brain a bit differently, it lines up really well with Maslow. We can't be our best selves. There's no way I'm going to get my kids to do their most creative work if they can't operate in the cortical zone. Think about this. Are you your best self when you're hungry? It's like the Snickers commercials, right? When that's going on, you can't get up into these upper echelons. And so trying to teach students briefly how to interpret the information of what they're seeing going on in the brain at different areas. This information is then going to be applied to the conversations they'll then have with the survivor avatar. Now, one caveat I probably should have mentioned a little bit ago is that all of these lesson plans are designed with the in mind that both the teacher and the student have an iWitness account through the University of Southern California's Shoah Foundation program. All of this is free. I know that in some districts, there have been issues of trying to get students to like sign up or have one more thing downloaded on a district device. However, this does not collect information, but I promise you is going to be worth whatever small fight needs to go into this. There are a couple of things that I think are important to show you before I can move forward. And I am hoping right now that you are actually seeing the iWitness screen, and that what you're then seeing here below are the number of available testimonies that can be used currently from your classroom. But here's the coolest part. When you pull these testimonies up, this person is going to come to life. So for example, are you seeing Aaron here? He's going to wink at you in a minute. I sure hope so. We're going to have a quick chat with Aaron here in just a moment, but let me bring you back over so you understand what's on the line for right now. As of yesterday, when I double checked, there are 7 dimensions and testimony platforms, people, survivors, available. However, of the 12 lessons that I've created, only 5 of them are actually viable right now. The reason for this is, although more than 24 individuals have been interviewed and become, so to speak, virtual avatars, their information is not yet available to be used by the general public, which means right now, the only person whose information you can actually use is going to be Miss Ava Kaur. As I started thinking about the kinds of information a person might need in order to kind of use these resources, I certainly can't write Ava's story better than she could. By the way, the girls that you're seeing here in sepia tone and the young lady that she is pointing to here in this picture, that is Ava Kaur. Ava was a twin who had been experimented on under Dr. Mengele. Both she and her sister survived. And in the mid-1980s, Ava would go on to found a museum called Candles. Her museum eventually goes on tour to begin bringing teachers, as well as those who want to learn, more into her experience. And so a great deal of what I built in terms of my lesson plans is designed around this. I wanted ever so briefly just to show you an idea of kind of what these lessons look like. I also understand as a teacher that you never, ever get the amount of time that you're hoping for. And sometimes things go slow and sometimes things go fast. So I tried to leave them as open-ended as I could. Asking questions like, in the case of looking at Ava's experience and her deep memory of having a kind of wake-up moment in the barrack, What does the brain need for normal childhood development? What kinds of things are necessary in order for a child to develop in the ways that we expect? Why do kids need play? Why is it important to understand where exactly on the Auschwitz map did she live? And how far away is what's going on away from her home? As we move forward into the lesson, you're getting deeper into her ideas and the things that are going to end up impacting her over and over again. Meanwhile, we're also going to interject information about more learning about the brain and what happens when we enter into that survival mode, into that brainstem or lizard brain area. As this continues to go on, all of this is going to be then built up, and it culminates in this conversation that we get to have with Ava Core. The last couple of things I want to show you. I had done this information on Aaron Elster, and I had done this information for Fritzi Fritschall as well. Unfortunately, neither of their testimonies or avatars are able to be used from your classroom locally right now. I would highly encourage you to please petition the USC Shoah Foundation to release more of these programs so that survivor testimony can reach all of our students the way that the survivors intended them to be. With that in mind, since I do have access to Aaron, I want to show you just a little bit of how this can work. And I want you to know that not all questions may have to be academic. For instance, Aaron, are you married?
Boy, am I married. I've been married for 63 years to my beautiful wife, Jackie, who helped change my life in such wonderful ways.
Aaron, can you tell me your favorite color?
Green.
I hope I've humanized Aaron a little bit for you. I hope that you'll meet him and use the lessons as intended.
Thank you, Stephanie. Wish we had more time. Our third presenter today is Chris Harrison. Chris, are you ready?
I sure am, yeah.
Okay, the floor is yours, or the screen is yours.
All right, let me get to my presentation. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate. It's been great to get everyone's presentation material, and I'm learning a lot. So my work is titled Bringing the IRL in Real Life Back In, a Tactile Pedagogy of Responsible Genocide Education. So what am I looking at? Well, I just got a brief outline here for everyone here. Essentially, the problem that I'm examining is that we're seeing a lot of divisions in classrooms, and this comes down to generational divisions, pretty traditional with education, but also specifically since COVID, we've become a little bit more aware of these interpersonal divisions as well. What can help us to get into some of the responses to these divisions? I'm going to lean into universal design as well as tactile pedagogies, and I'll talk about that. Something really important to focus in on is safeguards, and I'll explain exactly what that means, as well as some examples with K20 differentiation. So the question I'm examining here is, how can Gen X and millennial educators narrow the generational divide between them and their Gen Z students? And obviously this can be broadened on both ends of that bookending, boomers and also future generations as well. So this is something that, as I said, we've seen this before over time, except now I think we've got this added element that's producing greater divisions, and it comes down to often the details of the particular students' lives. The student-centered approach is where I'm going with this, and so trying to get a sense of the social isolation, mental health crises, anxiety, and depression in particular, to figure out what else is going on for this current younger generation, both adults and adolescents. So the point of my presentation is an attempt to talk about how best, or to attempt to narrow some of these divides. And I lean on pioneering pedagogies of the past, things that have worked over time for that generational connection. And then also a little bit of a different take, which is this tactile pedagogy for the interpersonal aspects. So I'm riffing on something called bringing the state back in, which for anyone that studied political science, that's the idea of making sure that you're actually not forgetting to study the government when you're talking about politics. And so this one is more so like using the vernacular of today's generation, IRL, in real life. So what am I talking about with pedagogies that are pioneering, individuals who are charismatic? All right, so the OGs of Holocaust and genocide education, the great storytellers. I've been very fortunate to be in the same room as all three of the individuals I've got up here on the screen. Joyce, who was wonderful in her presentation earlier for the conference, also Herbert Hirsch in the middle, and Richard Hovhannissian. And this is from the old school, if you like, for genocide education, the Holocaust in particular, as well as Armenian genocide. And so as we're looking at these traditional master teachers, something that they've got in common is their ability to tell really engaging and captivating stories. At the same time, this can be something that more advanced, more focused students are able to pick up on and follow along with their imagination, whereas maybe there's something else that is leading into these divisions because it's an intangible and indirect learning process to listen along and then imagine what's happening with the stories and the narratives. So taking a kind of lead out of the book of master teachers in this way, I thought, well, what else could be something that I've seen here and there, and I've only got a few years of experience teaching college for 3 years now. The idea being when something is real, when something is in the room, when it's a guest speaker, when it's maybe a survivor, and the students are able to directly have a connection, a tangible connection, that I've seen something really switch from very passive to active learning. And so I'm kind of exploring this in this work, and be very interested to hear anyone else's feedback. And in the conference already, I've seen lots of presentations that talk about this hands-on approach. So the pedagogical history and success in particular for this tangible direct learning comes straight out of special education, gifted education. And on the screen, hopefully it's not too blurred for you, can see all of these various behavioral conditions and concerns that students have. The IEPs for K-12, the student accommodations for college instruction. And so we can actually look at the science, look at the data to say that there is an aspect of a compensatory type process for a lot of students now, where it isn't about just reading the material. It isn't literature and literacy-based comprehension. It isn't even necessarily only audio and visual for some documentary or something like that, but there actually has to be this tactile element of a tangible object that assists students to learn. So from this study here from Arnold and Ledley, it's just demonstrating the concepts where a game, a matching pair game, was put to two groups. One group, deaf and blind participants, another group, sighted hearing participants. The deaf and blind participants were able to take the cards that had different feelings, different textures, and complete the game quicker with fewer moves than the sighted hearing people participating in that experiment. And so there's something going on beyond kinetic, beyond audiovisual, beyond literacy comprehension. Well, so what? Well, a lot of the students these days, as we know, are very much hooked into screens. There is this social isolation, more generally speaking, in society that we've all experienced to some degree or another. And so how can we maybe flip this a little bit, especially now that we've got both several states with a mandate to teach Holocaust education, genocide education, and then also some students are now having to go into classrooms where they don't have that dependency anymore because the screens are actually locked away. And that's an increasing trend that we're seeing. So the use of props, right, similar to the cell phone, similar to the device, in a very respectable and responsible manner, which I'll talk about next, to bring this collaborative environment in real life in a more active participatory way. Get into this study in a little bit, but what I'm talking about here is mitigating the vicarious exposure to trauma. That's the really #1 key safeguard for essentially avoiding what Raphael Lemkin called genociditis, this burnout process that you can go too far into the material and then really suffer in all sorts of ways. And so navigating the academic study is very useful. So really quickly, just to get your sense, some examples at the end of the presentation, I want to get there. The study from Brockhouse and all 2011 talked about how therapists who worked with traumatized individuals could grow in their psychology, in their own professional growth. But the experiment was basically seeing, well, what helps with that? What might grow more for the individual therapist? And so this is kind of like what the teachers might look at in terms of growth, as well as students too. Organizational support, coherence, empathy. Those were the three factors that they tested to see if it changed the psychological, the professional growth of the therapists themselves. With greater institutional support, organizational support, there was nothing, there was no change one way or the other. And that's kind of surprising, especially based on where we put a lot of our resources when it comes to traumatic content. Coherence, so the more knowledge that the therapist knew about types of trauma and traumatic events, the less they actually wanted to grow in their field as an expert. And that's that burnout thing that I was mentioning, the genociditis aspect for us, genocide educators. And then empathy, positive predictor, greater reliability, they cared more, they wanted to grow more. Now, empathy, it's got different meanings, and I'll get into this real quick as well. But basically, we're talking about the ability to take on someone else's perspective in some way, relatability. Continuing debate that many of you have probably looked at in some way previously. And so really quickly, the two big sides of this debate from Krondorfer's work, Unsettling Empathy 2020. Empathy is not pity, it's not compassion, it's not sympathy. The key point here is being able to relate in some way. And it's very unsettling because of the contentious and traumatic content that we study and that we teach, that students study and learn about. And so you got to be cautious and safeguard when to bring in the additional level of vicarious trauma, and watch that, observe students in that process. And also be very aware the props themselves, the physical objects in the room, can actually have a toxic element to them. So think of all of the memorabilia that certain people collect. A different viewpoint here from Gubkin, 2015, and this is from Holocaust education in particular, the ability to switch from empathetic understanding to engaged witnessing. And this is a safeguard to avoid overly stimulating the emotional responses in students. So that's also a very valid point to think about. And so that range of the debate on empathy has let me, it reminded me about a piece from Bruce Perry. It's quite a kind of classic piece on the psychology of students, and his work, Theory and Learning, essentially tracks safety as a place which then can spark curiosity, as well as avoiding this overwhelming aspect. But if people are going through an overwhelming aspect in the content they receive, then they look for the familiar. So on this continuum, this table here, we're looking for some type of sweet spot between these 2 points. Students are calm, and then they're also active. They don't get into these more fight, fear responses, as we've already heard in different presentations. So let me go through a couple of examples for us here as educators. I didn't necessarily pick out anything that really I knew about from my experience that may work in elementary, but especially with states that have a mandate for middle school, high school, this process here, my suggestion here, bring the in real life back in through responsible relatability. And so watching out between humanization, which may be taken on as some kind of toxic element. And so this is really bringing up the point of who do we empathize with? I've heard, and I haven't used it in the classroom, but I've heard different movies, different books where the empathy is for, people who are affiliated to the perpetrator group rather than survivors, generations that have tried to deal with the trauma, and the societies that haven't actually figured out ways to address confronting historic injustices. So a couple of examples here. I've got middle school, the idea of role playing in very sensitive ways, right? So it's almost kind of shifting away from the highly traumatic content to recognizing what the cultural aspects were in a particular case, what the identities were. So something I've seen used very well is mask construction, where students actually build something in the room, the paper mache, chicken wire type product with the activity, and bringing this about, someone involved in some way, again, watching out for those kind of lines that you would not want to cross, because it's having those problems of who's receiving the relatability, who are the individuals involved, what are the events involved, and maybe a mannequin that's in the room that students add to as they read different testimonies, as they learn about a particular case and a particular individual. And then on-site installations, very much hands-on aspects that we've seen traditionally in this set of grades. For high school, now we're talking about 3D printers in particular. So imagine a sense of having an object that doesn't represent the highly traumatic content, but is much more so about the comprehension from studying the materials, from having an empathetic relatability aspect with a particular set of events. And so watching out for the non-traumatic element of a testimony-based prop construction. Think of all of the trades, all of the crafts, all of the hands-on workshops for high schools, metalwork, woodwork, shop. Those kind of age-adjusted versions of the middle school curriculum, and then also getting to the more kind of active theatre aspects. And these suggestions come out from my reading on theatrical visualizations and installations in an art museum, particularly to broaden the educational accessibility. And I've got that cited in a little bit for you at the end. And then more traditionally for college, yeah, we're talking about the study abroad programs, one-to-one group discussions with survivors on site in the room, having those conversations, experts too, guest speakers, photos. Something I've seen in my experience, and you're probably all aware of this already, is the need to respect and be aware of sensitivity in a religious context for individuals who cannot observe certain images. So in Arizona, it's very much indigenous American tribes who cannot be in the room when there is a body, for instance, on a photo.
Sorry to interrupt. Be aware you've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm just wrapping it up. And so these aspects of multi-generational memories that can make the connections, that can help investigate these legacies. And then museum items. Watching out for museum items, people who can bring in effects into the room and also then present on those details. Here's my citations. Thank you ever so much for your time.
And actually, Chris, the first question is for you. So Maureen wants to know how we, and I think this is a great question that applies beyond the tactile, which is what Maureen mentions, but how do we deal with not traumatizing students?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I did go through that on several of the slides, but yeah, I'll reiterate a few ideas here. Prefacing, front-loading the experiences, having someone come in. I mean, if you've gone through the process yourself where this genocide-itis topic becomes an element of the teaching content, that can really help have students recognize, well, you got to watch yourself, you got to be aware of what's going on when you get involved in learning about these traumatic events. I mean, I've read just today actually on this idea of genocide-itis, there's a somewhat autobiographical piece on Lemkin from his personal notes and his papers. It's put together by Donna Lee Fries, and I can write this out in the chat if you like. It's a book called Totally Unofficial. And so it's the experience of Lemkin right after working with the UN in 1948 and for the years before then, where after achieving the UNCG, he then booked himself into a hospital for 3 weeks because of this burnout, because of the vicarious elements of taking on content that is traumatic and disturbing. And so we have a lot of work left to do on that. I don't think that there's enough in institutional programming for PhDs, for master's students, and obviously, yes, absolutely for K-12. So it's kind of a somewhat new aspect, but we've seen it across different presentations, watching out when you're getting into this hands-on content, this direct kind of touch element. And so my experience, and I don't see anything in the literature yet on it, but it's essentially, again, shifting it away from the highly, highly toxic products and physical objects. Just think of anything from the Nazi era to a particular concept in the culture that's impacted. So it could be bringing in an object for the survivors and the ancestors of genocide for the Holocaust. It might be someone from the synagogue bringing in an item from the synagogue to then provide some kind of physical object that can connect to the culture.
And thank you, Chris. And a new question came in addressed to you as well. So come back on the screen. This is from Rayhan, who says, Chris, thanks so much for such a helpful presentation. In your experience, what is the right age, if there is any, for a child to learn the very basic meaning of the word genocide?
Excellent question. Thanks ever so much. And I'll be as quick as I can on this because I'm sure other presenters want to get to their questions. For me, I think it is an element where we're seeing social studies in middle school, and it depends on the teaching. It's in the United States, it's a federalized process, so there's no you can't say it all across the board. There's a lot of pushback when those attempts are done. Think of Common Core. So middle school, I would say, when issues of bullying, issues of violence are also in the curriculum, issues of studying the wars, especially world wars, and putting us alongside that, then these other forms of destruction that can tie in with those broader lessons at that point. So somewhere in the 7th, 8th grade, the kind of 9-10 age group, I think, is the very, very earliest, but it would depend on the kind of the level of institutional resources, I'd say, to do with those other elements of violence in some form.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, Chris, I teach genocide at the university level at a small liberal arts, selective liberal arts college. And I find it difficult to make generalizations about students. So I remember the first time I was teaching a genocide course, before registration, one of my students in another course came up to me and said, is it going to be difficult? And I was like, oh my God, yes. I had just been reading survivor testimony. And I said to this student, when I was in my 60s at the time, I said, I can't read more than a couple of pages of survivor testimony without tearing up. And so forth. And she was like, oh, that's not what I meant. I meant, are we going to have to write a long paper? And that's what she meant by, is the course difficult? And I find at the college level that my students are all over the place with their emotional reactions too. So how do I be mindful of that when I'm planning, when I'm teaching a course? Chris, help me out here.
I agree. I mean, the best ways I've had that is the one-on-one sessions with my mentors. So many of you might have met Paul Bartrop over the years, and he would straight up start with pictures of children in the Holocaust. That would be the first thing he'd talk about, and he'd just get straight into the really deep end of the emotional stuff in the classroom, and then really put the brakes on to see who wants to carry on with learning this stuff, because this is very much so the tip of the iceberg. And like you said, the testimonies, I think that we could have more talked about, more recognition of the impact of burnout, the impact of working through really, really challenging material on that emotional and psychological element that happens as we study this material. And I think that a lot of the kind of socialization processes that do go on effectively in K-12 in particular are things that people that teach college level students, they can really get a great sense of, well, what does work, what is important, but don't make it kind of well, I should say don't for you, but for me, I have found that I have to kind of build that into the material for students to get a sense of what that is, right? So you talking about empathy, showing the different outcomes, really getting a sense of what someone's assumption may be on what another group might want you to study and talk about, but it actually turns out that no, you need to hear directly from the group themselves. And that's where you can start to kind of build those more direct relationships for students as well. And it's tough because I mean, maybe people know, maybe you could let us know, let me know. Have we done this before? Has maybe Holocaust studies earlier on in a different generation looked at the psychological impacts on scholars, on students, in some more kind of broad sense for what is useful, what is responsible, and really letting people know. So I don't know how it would work for K-12 or middle school. Like I think that's where the beginning points should be, along with other forms of violence. But for my college students, I'll use the Bruce piece that says, here, do you know that trauma has impacted your education as a person? Watch out for yourself, manage yourself, right? Step out of the room when you need to. And kind of a lot of the regular policing that goes on from what I was trained in to do, I had to just drop most of that stuff, right? The idea that I would be the policing agent on the university rules for how they could behave, how they could respond. Some of it is, really sparking very highly fight or flight responses in students without any training, right? There was nothing for me on that side for my particular training, other than a couple of very good multiple conversations with Bartrop, particularly for me, just kind of schooling me, like, watch out for yourself when you get into it, but also be mindful of what your students are going to go through as well.
We have a question for Stacey. Stacey, this is from Maureen again. Stacey mentioned other high impact practice besides the Moot court. What other strategies do you offer for teaching genocide or other traumatic experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, what I've been using for the past, I guess 2-3 years now, is I use the resources at the Shoah Center at the University of Southern California, particularly the survivors' testimonies, because in my genocide class, as most of you know, you're teaching genocide, there's the law part, there's sort of like the history part, but I always use the survivors' testimonials because I feel that it brings them back into like the victims of these atrocities. So it's a human crime happening to humans, and it's not just some theoretical kind of event. And so what I have them do is I have them listen to 3 testimonies of survivors from one particular genocide. Now, I recommend to them, like, sometimes you can use, if you're looking at the Holocaust, there's all kinds of testimonies from actual survivors. There's testimonies from the people that liberated Auschwitz. There's testimonies from homosexuals who were targeted, Roma who were targeted. I recommend that they use kind of a wide variety, so they get a clear picture that how complex the crime was, who the victims were, what it was like. And then after they listen to their 3 testimonials from a particular genocide, I have them write a paper basically saying, given all that you've learned so far, you've learned, what happened in the Holocaust, what happened in, the Armenian genocide, and what the law is, how does this change your perception of the crime of genocide, right? Because, it's bringing them back down to earth. And I found that that's been hugely successful. Yeah, it broadens their perceptions of the crime of a particular genocide and of genocide in general. Excuse me. And I also, and a separate thing, I also use virtual field trips. So we've gone to the Holocaust Center for Humanity in Seattle, right? I've done that a number of times, and that's a really great. Anybody who wants the link, I'm sure you probably already know the link. But it's a really great for those who've never even don't really know that much about the Holocaust. It's a really great like intro kind of experience. And then after that, I have them, this is like more in the beginning of the semester, I have them write an essay So given what, I guess, really what little you know about it, so how did that, open your, broaden your perspective on, the Holocaust? Because I mean, most people know there was the Holocaust in World War II, but they don't really understand what happened. And it's really a great way to sort of a segue into like bigger topics, that we teach about in genocide classes. So I found that works really well. And the beauty part about experiential essays, and I'll say this is the last thing, is that Chat GPT, you don't have to worry about Chat GPT, right? That's one of those things that it's just, oh, it's just horrible. This way it's their experience. And so if I pick up like they're just describing the museum or describing, then I'm like, that's Chat GPT. So you can bust them really easily. And this way it gets them back into, I want to hear your words, not some AI, whatever. And so it really works well for that. I just want to add that. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you for the good question.
I'm going to wrap up the Q&A just a couple minutes early because we don't have a break time scheduled before our keynote address.